welcome to everyone, and we're delighted to have to be engaged with a dialogue between Athena Peralta and Rev David Haslam. So Athena is the director of the Commission on Climate Justice and Sustainable Development for the World Council of Churches. I hope I've got that right, Athena, and that things haven't changed in the last year. But and David Haslam is an associate minister at Evesham Methodist Church with a long history of engagement in struggles for justice, being very involved with movements such as the anti-apartheid movement and the Church's Commission for Racial Justice. And he's just published his autobiography, which was launched in the House of Lords in I think last month. So Athena and David, thank you very much for coming on. I understand that David, you'll be sort of putting some questions to Athena. I think that's how I understand the format is going to work. So over to you, David, to talk about the theme for this evening, which is the Zacchaeus project, or the ZacTax. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that.
Okay, thank you, and thanks to everyone else for joining us. Yes, in fact, we communicated with Athena. We slightly changed the structure, which I'm glad we did now, given what's happening to me. But I'm going to paint a bit of background, and then Athena is going to talk to you about what the issues are at the moment. So it'll be a bit less of a conversation, but I'm sure there will be opportunity for others to join in before too long. But I just wanted to paint a bit of background about the World Council of Churches for those who don't know that much about it, and because it's been certainly a great influence in my life and quite a powerful entity on the world scene, although that's diminished perhaps in more recent years, partly through lack of resources and indeed the influence of the churches, as we know, has rather diminished, sadly, in recent years. But it's got a great history, and it's important, I think, that people hold on to that, especially in terms of the way the world is at the present time. I mean, the World Council of Churches began in 1948, post the Second European War, or European-based war, and it has an assembly every 6-7 years, maybe sometimes 8. And I was fortunate enough at the beginning of my ministry to attend the Fourth Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Uppsala in Sweden in 1968. And that was a life-changing experience for me, because for the first time meeting Christians from all around the world who challenged those from the West, and they were still in a minority in those days. It's changed now, but certainly Western European and Americans dominated, as they have so often done in the past. But we heard some very strong messages from the South, in quotes, the global South. And that particular assembly focused on issues of race, of inequality, including colonialism and its aftermath, and also on the growing climate crisis. Even then, in 1968, the World Council of Churches had its finger on that issue, and then I would say in following on from that, it built particularly with the program to combat racism, which began in 1969, a real prophetic edge. And that related to a real challenge to the whole apartheid system, although not just that, but also issues of race in Australia, in the United States, and of course in Europe also. And the PCR, as it was called, went on for another 30 plus years and was influential in the ending of apartheid. And of course, Nelson Mandela gave great praise to the WCC because of what that program to combat racism had done. But then in 1975, also in the assembly at Nairobi, the World Council instituted a program on transnational corporations. And again, well ahead of its time, because it could see coming this development of corporatism, where the big companies are so dominant, and indeed neoliberalism and that model of economy, and so it's proved that that their influence has grown and grown, and that leads us on to what we'll be saying in a few minutes, or that Athena will. And that program ran for 5 or 6 years, and I was part of it and learnt a lot. Unfortunately, was terminated in 1983 at the Vancouver Assembly, largely because the American and German churches, who contributed most of the money to the World Council, and the Swiss as well to some degree, because it was based in Geneva, of course, in Switzerland, didn't like the program on transnational. They didn't like the program to combat racism, but they liked the program on transnational corporations even less. And although it was a prophetic program, it was ended at that time, although the ripples went on through some of us who used the contacts that we'd made in that context. But then more recently, that sort of prophetic economic and prophetic edge has developed into what's called NIFEA, the new International Financial and Economic Architecture, the NIFEA program, which again Athena will could say much more about later, because she's now responsible for that. But that saw the importance of challenging this whole economic structure, and it led to this this consultation that we held in Durban 6 years ago. Actually, 6 years to the day, we were there in Durban talking about this tax as a key element of how to address the economic inequality in our world. And there were about 25 of us from about 16 different countries, and we evolved a program and some suggestions of how we could address the much needed new financial and economic architecture, and in particular on tax. And one of the specific ideas that came out of it was this Zacchaeus tax, from the consultations that some of us had. Now, I said to Athena that then she should take over and I would make a theological postscript, but I'm going to do that now in case I can't hang in there. But I just did want to relate to the story of Zacchaeus, because it is such a kind of influential or symbolic story, in that Zacchaeus, of course, was a very rich man, we're told, but he was an outsider. He'd become an outsider. He was despised by his people. And I think the wealthy in our world are going in the same direction, except most of them don't realize it yet. They are increasingly being disliked, even despised by the rest of it, because of their extreme wealth and because of the fact that increases of millions of pounds a day quite often, except for a group, and some you may know, called the patriotic millionaires, who have formed together and said, we are unhappy about the tax levels we pay, and this is particularly in the US and Britain. And Warren Buffett, actually, one of the richest men in the world, has also intimated this. We should pay more taxes. So there is a sign of what's salvation, because, of course, the last key line of the Zacchaeus story, when Zacchaeus has said what he said and made his offer, Jesus said, salvation has come to this house today. And that is salvation for the wealthy, to see what the corner that they're painting themselves into. And our job, I think, is actually bluntly to save their souls, because without them realizing what they're doing, without us, their souls may not be saved. So that's my input, and I'm going to hand on to Athena.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing that beautiful story also about the role of churches in prophetic witness for justice and for sustainability. And I also look forward to reading your biography, because I'm sure that you have also contributed a lot to this important work of the churches. So yeah, ZacTax. And, I think it was really when we were trying to, figure out what are we going to call this campaign for tax justice, when we met in Durban, some years ago. I mean, it was really great when someone had the bright idea of like we can call it the ZacTax campaign, based on the story of Zacchaeus, and which David has already shared, is very much about how to enact the conversion of Zacchaeus in our financial systems, and how to financial systems which have been very much focused on enriching the already wealthy and powerful, and how can we turn this around and instead have reparations. And so this is really great that we managed to find this important biblical story and example of conversion. So the ZacTax campaign has 4 calls for tax justice. And the first is a call for a comprehensive wealth tax at the global level, but also it calls for progressive wealth taxes, at national levels as well. And the idea here is, really to enact these taxes so that we can tackle runaway inequality, to curb these really rising and destructive levels of inequality, while at the same time raising revenues for important services such as health, such as education, and other social services. So first call is for wealth taxes. And then the second call is for a stop to tax evasion and avoidance by multinational corporations and affluent individuals. So we have plenty of studies and statistics showing that the global South, developing countries, lose over $1 billion every year because of tax tricks and loopholes. And of course, these losses hamper the capacity of governments to raise the revenues needed to deliver quality public services. And these public services are also human rights obligations. So this means that these tax losses have implications as well on governments meeting their human rights obligations to citizens. But these are also resources, that are needed to respond, for instance, to climate change. And so this call to stop tax evasion and avoidance means concretely, that we have to ensure that multinational corporations are paying taxes where economic activities occur. This means closing tax havens. This means publishing country by country reports of profits. And this also means creating a tax body, at the United Nations in order to build a more transparent and fairer system of corporate taxation. And later I will share a bit more about the UN tax body, because there has been some significant developments on this. Okay, so those are, I've mentioned 2 calls, so there are 2 more. The third call is a call for progressive carbon and pollution taxes, carbon taxes in particular, and I have to say carbon taxes on big corporations and wealthy consumers, can help curb emissions and again, at the same time, raise revenues so that governments can invest in renewable energy and pay for the costs of climate change mitigation, adaptation, as well as loss and damage for climate vulnerable countries. The fourth call for tax justice is a call to implement a financial transaction tax. And there's many reasons for this, including that such a tax could help curb speculation, which is, quite destructive. But also, again, it could raise money for global public goods, but also for reparations, for instance, for the transatlantic slave trade and other historical injustices. Now, the ZacTax Campaign links tax justice with reparations. And I think this is quite important, to point out that we see taxation as a means of reparations. There are also a couple of calls related to reparations, including the establishment from taxation of an enslavement reparation fund. And there is also a call for the cancellation of foreign debt foreign debt owed by developing countries as a further measure to bring about reparation, especially for colonialism. So those are the key calls of the ZacTax Campaign. And interestingly, there have been a couple of developments in the past year, a couple of exciting, developments. The first is that at this very moment, a UN tax convention is being negotiated. And this took a decade of campaigning. The ZacTax Campaign started 6 years ago, and this was one of the key calls as well. In November 2023, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution that began the process for negotiating a UN tax convention. And it was really, the leadership of African countries, the African group that really pushed for this together with, the group of 77 developed countries. And so the negotiations for a UN tax convention officially began just last month, actually. Another interesting development, wealth taxes. For the first time, wealth taxes entered into the agenda of the G20. Last year, Brazil was host to the G20. And they pushed for a wealth tax with the support as well of countries such as Colombia, France, South Africa, Spain, and the African Union. Although in the final declaration of the G20, there was no clear call for a wealth tax or a minimum global income tax. Still, the G20 for the first time agreed to, and I quote, engage cooperatively to ensure that ultra high net worth individuals are effectively taxed. So these are, a couple of, important wins for those of us who have been campaigning for tax justice. But I think it's important to, we have those two wins, but I think tax justice has never been more relevant. For many of us, both in developing countries, but also in the UK, ordinary people are experiencing a cost of living crisis. And governments, can choose, to cut, say, life-saving development aid, can choose to cut budgets for basic services, which of course harm families that are living in poverty. Or they can address the cost of living crisis and raise revenue, particularly by taxing corporations, by taxing the wealthiest, so that they support those who are in need. And this is a choice that governments can make. And then we have inequality again, which was when we were talking about inequality 6 years ago, when we initiated the ZacTax campaign, it was pretty bad. But every year it gets worse. And inequality is at levels that are at levels that are so high that it is, already undermining democracies. And we can see what's also happening on the other side of the world in North America. The 2025 Oxfam report reveals quite an alarming forecast. It shares that we could see 5 trillionaires emerge in the next few years. 5 trillionaires, even as 3.6 billion people continue to live in poverty. And we know, we can see now that with the election of Trump, the billionaire class is expected to further gain considerable political clout, positioning itself to shape significantly both economic and ecological policies. So there's runaway climate change that's undermining democracies, but we are also facing a climate emergency. And we know that the science is telling us that we really have just a few years to address the crisis. We also have studies that are, telling us that developing countries will need trillions of dollars. I think the figure is 2.4 trillion to respond to the climate crisis. And even though there have been some positive developments at the UN climate conferences, including, for instance, the establishment of a loss and damage fund, the question, is, where will the funds come from? And we know that it is the very rich, that emit huge and unsustainable amounts of carbon, and they also have a, huge and outsized influence on our economy. So unlike ordinary people, the world's richest people, 70% of their emissions are the result of their investments. Again, we have this compelling Oxfam study that calculates the annual carbon footprint of the carbon footprint of the investments of just 125 billionaires. And the carbon footprint of the investment of those 125 richest billionaires is equivalent to the carbon emissions of France, which is a country of 67 million people. So on average, the billionaires emit 3.1 million tons of carbon dioxide, which is 1 million times higher than the average for someone living, for someone in the bottom 90% of humanity. So climate justice, also demands, climate justice demands that wealthy countries, wealthy corporations, and individuals who are the drivers of climate change and who have built their wealth on extraction, they should be the ones to pay for costs of adaptation and loss and damage. And this is really the polluter pays principle. But how do we implement the polluter pays principle? And again, taxation is a very practical way to implement the polluter pays principle. So this is the issue, the burning issues of the day. And we see that tax justice can play an important role in addressing issues of cost of living crisis, addressing issues of inequality and the erosion of democracy, as well as is critical for addressing the existential challenge of our generation, which is climate change. So these are the issues, and maybe as part of my my discussion as well with David on how to share the ZacTax campaign with you, he said that it would be also important to say something about what can churches do, what can ordinary congregations do. So maybe I will go into that very quickly, and then hopefully we can have a bit more of discussion. So I think the first thing is we have to get excited about tax justice. It is exciting. Tax justice is a moral issue. It's really important for people of faith to study the issues around taxation and reparation, through the lens of the covenantal relationships that God calls us into with each other and also with the earth. We can also, contribute stories about, how tax justice can change our lives. We can contribute Bible studies and theological reflections that creatively and prophetically read the Zacchaeus story. We can practice what we preach in our institutional lives, organizing our finances as churches or as faith-based institutions in line with the Zacchaeus principles, in line with principles of sharing of resources and reparation for historical injustice. And obviously, churches and congregations can join the ZacTax campaign. And this means raising the issues of taxation and reparation in various contexts, and lobbying our governments, lobbying international financial institutions for tax and reparative justice. So I think I will end here for now.
Thank you very, very much, Athena and David. And so the floor is open to questions. If you have a question and know how to raise your hand on Zoom, please do. Otherwise, wave generally, and Kat will try and spot you. David, was there anything else that you wanted to say, if you feel up to saying it, or would you prefer just us to go ahead with
No, it's okay. I'm still here, just about. But one thing I forgot to say was that, as well as the World Council, there are other ecumenical bodies involved, and it's important for people to know that the World Conference of Reformed Churches, WCRC, the Council for World Mission, which is again a Reformed network, and I think the Lutheran World Federation now,
That's correct.
Athena,
Yep.
are involved. And the World Methodist Council on the fringes a bit as well. So it is also an international sort of economic campaign. What I will also add is, if any of you said, well, I've never heard of the ZacTax, sadly we haven't managed to get the British churches to pick this up. We've had a Church Action for Tax Justice campaign, which has now come under the umbrella of the Just Money movement, and certainly would encourage all to be involved in that. But there is a sort of groundswell there, which we're looking to sort of engage with, build on, for the church's contribution towards the campaign for, I'd say, wealth taxes, because there's different ways of creating wealth taxes, and some people say a wealth tax as such is very difficult. It's not easy, but there are other ways of adjusting the tax system to make it much fairer, and to take from those who've got the most.
Thank you. Kathy, you've got a hand raised, so please unmute and put your question.
Well, thank you. This is a bit new to me. I knew a bit about tax justice campaigns, but and I'm on some mailing lists for that sort of thing, but they're secular and they're in this country. I didn't really understand that so much was going on internationally. But as you say, maybe the British churches aren't so much involved. Now, if our government, I mean, the current government, the Labour government even, isn't really into taxing the rich within the country, how on earth do you expect them to get involved in some kind of international campaign?
Well, if I could just respond to that, I mean, there is quite an active undercurrent, as it were, and in the UK there is Tax Justice UK. There's also the Tax Justice Network, which is international, though based in the UK, and is one of those international campaigns with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. So again, another element to this, who are pushing for the kind of debates that Athena referred to in the G20 and in the UN, because what we're saying is that at the moment, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is based in Paris and which is the sort of rich countries' front for economic development, has too much control over the tax system. And what the developing countries are saying is this should shift to the UN. There should be a UN tax convention, and that's where international tax policy should be developed. And there is, of course, great resistance from the Western countries and indeed the United States, which will be even stronger now under Trump. But nevertheless, there is a challenge, and there are those groups in this country. There is the all-party parliamentary group on responsible taxation, which is actually co-chaired by a Conservative ex-minister, Andrew Mitchell, along with a Labour Party MP. It was Margaret Hodge, but she's moved out of the Commons now. But so that's there, and they are raising these issues all the time, and our government is being pushed in the same way that by the campaigners, in the same way that the French and the Dutch and the Germans and the Danes and so on are also being pushed by the tax justice lobbies in their own country. And of course, you don't hear much about it because it's not something that much of our media is very interested in or willing to give visibility to, but it is there. And in this country, I guess for Christians anyway, the Just Money movement is the place to locate, and if you're not a member, do join. But also Tax Justice UK is active as well. See their website and get their podcast and see what they're doing.
Mark, you're the next.
Yes, I take your point on the UN tax convention and things being done globally. I would say that that's an issue that's outside the Overton window at the moment. But another issue that I wonder whether the churches should be leaning into heavily is modern monetary theory, which is also outside the Overton window most of the time. And have you any comments to make about that and how that could maybe lead to completely upturning the conversation and be a real driver towards proper system change?
I don't know if Athena's got any comment on that.
Yes, I think that at the start of the new International Financial and Economic Architecture Initiative, which came out of a meeting that was held in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This was immediately after the, well, not immediately after, but it was some years after the global financial crisis. And there was also some discussion around modern monetary theory. But it is still at discussion levels. We have decided to focus on global tax justice as perhaps a more practical way forward, at least in given the current situation. And also focusing again on the issue of on debt. But I would say that there has been some discussion, but it hasn't been picked up as much, and probably it's the time to do so. And I hope Mark can say a bit more about modern monetary theory.
Yeah, perhaps we could just get back to you. And so Claire's asked that question. Could you just explain your understanding of that term?
Well, it's very simplest. I just think that it's explaining to people that that governments who have a fiat currency can create money whenever they need it. They just type the figures into a spreadsheet and their central bank lends money into existence. So that explains why after the financial crisis, quantitative easing was possible. It explains why if you want to go to a war in Iraq, the government can produce the money just like that, instantly. Or if they want to run a furlough scheme during a pandemic, they can create 800 billion in no time at all. So it's all, the government, can create money when it needs it. And the relevance of tax is to prevent the money supply getting out of control, and you tax to reduce inflation. So it's a fantastic system in that the government could produce money to do the universal basic services, the universal basic income, all the things that the poor half of society in developed countries and lots of the populations in the third world could benefit from that. And the tax falls on the wealthy, who would end up paying back in to reduce the inflation that you want to avoid as you sort of print the money. So it's a way of encompassing everything and doing your reparations and your loss and damage, whatever else you want to do, all in one nice package. And I think the reasons it isn't been taken up is that the people that it would hurt most are the rich and powerful, the plutocrats, who basically have got all governments by the throat at the moment. And it would be up to us as the demos to change that. And we have to find a way of doing that. So that's why modern monetary theory, or the magic money tree, is so attractive.
Thank you. Let's move on to a few other questions. So Catherine next.
Thank you, David and Athena. So I'm a bit of a novice as well, but am I right that there are underlying assumptions for tax systems? So there could be an oppressive tax, and I think that in Zacchaeus' day the tax was oppressive, whereas there's also a tax for the common good, and I think Christian Aid has written a report called just that. And I see parallels with the 4 aims you talked about, Athena, and particularly for climate mitigation and adaptation. Is the underlying assumption always now that tax is for the common good, and is that okay? Or do we need a global framework to ensure that there are not oppressive tax systems?
Well, I would say yes, I think we do need that global framework, and that's where the UN Tax Convention would come into its own. I think the usual language we would use is regressive or progressive tax, and still quite a bit of our taxation system is regressive rather than progressive. Regressive tax, for example, is VAT, which is exactly the same for everybody, rich and poor, on the goods or services that you buy, and so that operates, against the poor. Income tax is a progressive taxation, but it's not quite as progressive as it ought to be. And one of the interesting little quirks about the two is I heard Pat McFadden, the government cabinet minister, just yesterday on the Today programme, slipping out this little comment that, in the context of a wealth tax, and why not a wealth tax? A third of tax is paid by the wealthy, and it's not true. A third of income tax is paid by the top, whatever, 5 or 10%, because they can afford it. But that's only income tax. It's not the whole tax system, and it's a much lower proportion when you add in VAT and the endless smaller amounts of tax that occur around the system. So it's that kind of little sleight of hand that you think, oh, come on, let's be honest about this. We know why we have a problem with the wealth tax in this country, because the wealthy control a lot of the media. And there was a classic example over the non-dom tax coming up to the budget, if people might remember, last October, where originally the government was saying they were going to put, I forget what exactly the figures were, 20% non-dom tax. Non-dom tax was going to be brought in those people who live here but don't pay any taxes, and they were going to have to start paying tax at a reasonable rate. But by the time the lobbying and the media, especially the Daily Telegraph and others, had got onto it, that was reduced and reduced until it became a much smaller kind of contribution in the end. So this is what we're up against, the constant power of the wealthy through the media, and not telling people the whole truth about the way that the tax system works. That's the battle we've got.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, can I just add that aside from the principle of of progressivity, there is also the polluters pay principle that we should be lifting up, especially in response to the climate emergency.
Peter.
Yes, just following on from David's point, it's fair to say that the tax system was a lot more progressive in the past than it is now, certainly in this country, and I think in the United States similarly. And although we hear a lot of, frankly, rubbish about trickle-down economics, a period of rapid and sustained economic growth after the war was also a time when the tax system was more progressive than it is today. Now, what I was going on to say, or had planned to say before I thought of saying that, is, do you think that the principal beneficiaries of capital taxation and moves to reduce inequality, both at the national and international level, would produce substantial benefits for the plutocrats themselves, paradoxically? Because if this situation continues, the history of the 19th century and the early 20th century suggests that the present circumstances will lead to war and bloody revolution, and the principal losers in such circumstances will be the plutocrats themselves. So the patriotic millionaires are onto a good thing from their point of view, because well, we remember what happened in the early 20th century when there was a considerable rise in equality and the plutocrats lost a lot of their capital. I think Professor Piketty would agree with me about this, but what do you think?
I don't know if David wants to respond, but I would tend to agree in a way. I think there is another Greek economist, I think it was Yanis Varoufakis, who kind of said that this is we are approaching the death of capitalism because of the extreme levels of inequality as well that we are seeing today. And I would tend to agree that for especially those, I think even some members of the patriotic millionaires have clearly said, that this is also about our self-interest. It's not just that we want to be goody-goody and charitable, but this is also about our self-interest and the survival of our companies and corporations. So I would say that these extreme levels of inequality are bad for not just people living in poverty, but for the rest of society, including the wealthy sectors of society as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, the challenge to us is how can we get them to see the light and save their souls, if we're going to put it that way. And it is about ongoing campaigning and raising the questions and challenging. I mean, just one other little issue which has a bit of a link with the Isle of Man, because that's where I know Kat and maybe others here are based, but this whole issue of what are called PARBOs, public registers of beneficial ownership, or publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownership, which in the UK we've been endeavouring to persuade our tax havens, the small islands, mostly in the Caribbean and some elsewhere, to create publicly accessible registers of the trusts and foundations and the companies who base themselves there in order to avoid tax. And that's a real battle to get them to actually deliver on that. And by law, Britain has jurisdiction in those entities, and it could and should be forcing them to do this, but they're perennially resistant. And the part of the issue, of course, is they say, well, our economy is based on having 1,000 companies based in our islands, and they're not here, there's nobody there, kind of thing, but they've got post office boxes, kind of thing, and maybe one staff member, but that's it. And that's sometimes the cleaner. So that system is continuing, but we do have to pay, and we've had some conversation with Caribbean church leaders about this, that we do have to say, well, provide an alternative economy so that they can actually be honest about where they're getting much of their income from, and start creating these publicly accessible beneficial ownership registers, so that we can all know just who's based there and something more of what they're up to.
Thank you. Robbie.
Okay, yeah, question about the wealth tax. And so in two parts, really. I mean, first of all, I think the Green Party is the only party in Britain that has advocated to bring such a thing in if they got into power, which would be a fine thing. Is nobody else is doing it? That's the first question. And then the second thing is that I'm sure I saw Andrew Neil interviewing a Green Party leader in the run-up to the last election about the wealth tax, and he basically said it's been tried. He had 2 or 3 examples of countries where a wealth tax has been tried, and he said it failed everywhere. He didn't go into details. It could be something along the lines of what the last speaker was just saying about, the rich people that know what they're doing just hive everything off to the Isle of Man or the West Indies tax havens or something. But basically, my question is, does anybody know of any successful examples hitherto of wealth taxes actually raising money and doing what we think they are set out to do?
Athena, you're going to try that one first?
Maybe just to say that we know that in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Spain and I think also Colombia implemented a wealth tax. I don't have enough information to know whether it was it managed to substantially raise resources, but we do know that there are at least a couple of countries that have tried to do so, and also these are the same countries as well that are in the forefront of that were in the forefront of pushing for a wealth tax at the G20 as well. But I would have to say I would have to do a bit more research to see how successful.
I mean,
it is a tough one, yes, and it's fair to say that there are no good examples of the way this has worked, and that's partly because we don't have an international tax system which means that the wealthy can jump from one country to another, and that's why this bringing in, and through the G20, of the 15% tax rate. I mean, that was brought in. We were hoping it'd be 25%. That should be the norm for taxation around the world, and it was lowered to 15, partly because of the Irish, because they had a 15% and they didn't want to raise it, so they resisted that higher level. So there's always someone, you know, who's going to put their oar in. But in general, the political push all the time now is to get this introduced. I mean, the French also tried it, and they succeeded for a time, but then again there was the pushback from those with wealth and power, and forcing them to reduce it and then ditch it in the end. So it's a struggle, but it's essential, actually, if we are going to raise the money to address poverty and address the climate crisis, because without that, where's the money coming from? Nowhere else. So, you know, we've just got to keep hammering away at it.
Thank you. So we're beginning to move towards the end of this session. There's questions from Kat, Mark, and I did see Catherine. Maybe she's anyway, Kat.
Thanks, John. I think Barbara might have had a hand up as well at one point. I'm not sure.
Just that there's a question from Theobil coming into this call from South Africa.
In the chat. Great.
In the chat that I thought we should raise.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just going to concur with everything that's been said about how tricky it is to calculate, to find the liquidity for, to administer a wealth tax, especially if you bring it down to too low a level. David and I were at a presentation, I think that was, it wasn't the Patriotic Millionaires one. So we've been to a couple of things in Westminster where there have been moves, there was a move to introduce an APPG, a parliamentary group, specifically to work on wealth taxes. And we took advice from an academic, a pair of academics, one of whom was Aaron Advani, very worth looking up. And he's written a report for the Wealth Tax Commission, I think. And as well as acknowledging the difficulty of it, not least because people will try very hard not to pay it if they can, they were recommending that rather than, I think when I was working for Church Action for Tax Justice, we were looking at 1% on wealth over $1 million, which brings a lot of households into the net that might not expect to and might not have the liquidity. But they felt that HMRC, our tax authority, would cope better and be really able to investigate closely if it, instead of 1% on everyone with $1 million, it was 2% on those with 10 million or more. That makes the pool of accounts that they've got to look at much, much smaller. And so it's a different, more specialized team looking at the kinds of tricks that wealthy people can try and use. So I just mentioned that for completeness. And I think what we were saying before, it's what they call a wicked problem, isn't it? It's very complex. So you've got the issues of different taxers, and is it a myth? Is it not a myth that we've got to raise taxes to pay for services? But also money supply and systemic stuff. But also we have this world now where companies are paying shareholders and CEOs, even when they're not making profits, or even when they're not, take our water companies, they're not fulfilling their duties, they're still shoveling out dividends to their wealthy shareholders and putting up the bills, or paying their paying their workers so little that universal credit is having to make up the difference, our benefit system. So it hits the taxpayers again. In a way, we're having to put up taxes to pay benefits that that the corporate system should be funding. And that was it, really. Although I like the fact that, David, I have to remind myself a lot to love my neighbour, even when it's an oligarch or a billionaire politician. And so thank you for reminding me of that.
Okay, thanks, Kat. So can I just put the question that that Thobeli from South Africa put in the chat? This, I guess, is for Athena. He's from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and he's asking: Is the ZacTax program engaged with churches and church groups in South Africa?
Yes, so the quick answer would be yes. We convened a ZacTax meeting in Joburg, actually, a couple of years ago, where we managed to bring representatives from churches, not just in South Africa, but from the region. So we had the All Africa Conference of Churches, and specific councils of churches that have also picked up the ZacTax campaign. For instance, like the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, and I think the Namibia Council of Churches as well. And it's quite interesting because they see also a strong link between their resources and the extraction of their resources, and how they're not getting, much from their resources, and so they also look at it from that angle, and I think at that meeting we also had the participation from some parliamentarians as well from South Africa, including from non-Christian faiths. We had a Muslim parliamentarian who was quite excited about the ZacTax campaign. So the quick answer is yes. And as it happens, the World Council of Churches Central Committee will also be taking place in Joburg in June. So I think that will be another venue to deepen the ZacTax campaign in South Africa.
Thank you. Final question from Mark.
Yes, I've just wanted to tie some things together. I'm wondering whether I am Zacchaeus of the modern day, because I wanted to hear your opinions on limitarianism. That was a book written by Ingrid Robbins, a Belgian author, who basically was making the point lots of places has a minimum wage or a minimum income. And she was suggesting a maximum income at the other end, which actually ties in exactly what Kat says at the 10 million mark. She couldn't see how any individual needed more than 10 million to live a decent life. And the question is, do you set it at 10 million and start your progressive wealth tax at that level? Or I can see the other side of the equation, setting it at the 1 million that Kat suggested, and have a much wider net where we can be our good neighbours to our society around us. So there's the two sides of the coin. Where do you pitch it at? But what basic question is, what do you think of limitarianism, limiting the top end as well as having a safety net at the bottom end of income and wealth?
Yes, I mean, I haven't actually read the book, but I've discussed it with others and seen reviews of it and so on. Yeah, it's a good line. the practicalities are likewise are pretty enormous, but I think it should be talked up, as it were, as part of the whole context of the wealthy just being, apart from anything else, unable to spend all that they're getting. They can't even keep up with the rate at which their wealth is increasing, the top 1%, increasing too fast to be able to spend the money. So, you know, let's again help them out here. Come on, guys. I mean, you know, there needs to be some justice, some love of neighbour, and when you can find it in your hearts to say yes to the ZacTax or the wealth tax, then salvation will come to your house. So look forward to it.
Excellent. I just wanted to add that so I'm still in the middle of reading the book. I'm probably halfway through, but it struck me as well, you know, that, you know, churches, I think this was like more than 10 years ago, they were talking about, you know, a greed line. I mean, because, you know, everyone keeps talking about a poverty line, and, you know, but why not a greed line? So, so when I was reading the limitarianism, I was reminded of the work, including of Christian Aid but also the World Council of Churches on discussing what this greed line could look like and what it could be. And although I don't have at the moment like a strong you know, opinion on say 10 million or, you know, or 1 million, I think this is something that can be discussed further, and probably will also depend on the country. I mean, it's something that has to be, you know, part of a social dialogue as well. But I think what is clear is that there has to be a limit, and I'm reminded again of this this like really excellent campaign as well. You know, that it's not that we have to. It's not about make poverty history, but maybe we should be, you know, looking at wealth, you know, and wealth as the crux of the problem.
Make wealth history.
Yes, make wealth history. So, yeah, and yeah, totally echo also what David said, that, you know, praying and hoping that, you know, that salvation might come into the house.
So, thank you, Athena, and thank you, David, for sharing all your thoughts with us this evening, and also for some very interesting questions from Green Christian members and others attending the talk. Would it be fair to say, Athena and David, that you know, if people wanted to know more about the ZacTax, the World Council of Churches website would be the place to go, and in terms of the UK, the Just Money movement, the Just Money website would be the place to go, incorporating the church action on tax justice work.
Yeah, I feel you won't find much specifically about the ZacTax on the Just Money movement website. I've been trying to raise it and will continue to do so, but certainly that's where the edge of the campaign for the tax justice is within the churches in the UK. Yeah. So
do have a look at the World Council of Churches website, and thank you again, Athena and David,